day, everybody. I am Rosie Jane here, and our group was tasked to tackle about a specific country. And before I will spill what is a country, let me just give you some trivia for you to be able to guess it or to know it. So, this country is known as the land of the rising sun. So, it was once believed that this country was the first country to see the sunrise in the east in the morning. So, second, it has the third longest life expectancy, like in the world, with men living to 81 years old and women living to almost 88 years old. And the third one, it has a large economy, like having achieved remarkable growth in the second half of the 20th century after the devastation of the Second World War. So, any guesses? Okay, you have guessed it right. The country is no other than Japan. So, the capital of Japan is Tokyo, and the major cities are the following: Yokohama, Osaka, Nagoya, Sapporo, Kobe, Kyoto, Fukuoka. So, the type of government or the government, Japan has a constitutional monarchy headed by an emperor. So, the current emperor is Akihito. He wields very little political power, serving primarily as the symbolic and diplomatic leader of the country. So, the political leader of Japan is the prime minister, who heads the cabinet. So, Japan's bicameral legislature is made up of 465-seat House of Representatives and a 242-seat House of Councilors. So, Japan has 4-tier court system headed by the 15-member of Supreme Court. The country has European-style civil law system. So, Shinzo Abe is the current Prime Minister of Japan. The population, Japan is home to about 1.26 million people. So, today, the country suffers from a very low birth rate, making it one of the most rapidly aging societies in the world. So, the Yamato Japanese ethnic group comprises of 98.5% of the population. So, there are ethnic groups in Japan. The other is 1.5% includes Koreans, 0.5% Chinese, 0.4%, and the indigenous Ainu with 50,000 people. So, the Ryukyuan people of Okinawa and neighboring islands may or may not be ethnically Yamato. So, when it comes to languages, the vast majority of Japan citizens is 99% speak Japanese as their primary language, and Japanese is the Japonic language family and seem to be unrelated to Chinese and Korean. However, Japanese has borrowed heavily from Chinese, English, and other languages. In fact, there are 49% of Japanese words are loan words from Chinese and 9% come from English. So, their writing system, so 3 writing systems coexist in Japan. So, these are the hiragana, which is used for native Japanese words, inflected verbs, etc. So, katakana, which is used for non-Japanese loan words, emphasis, and onomatopoeia, and kanji, which is used to express the large number of Chinese loan words in the Japanese language. So, when it comes to religion, most Japanese citizens practice a syncretic blend of Shintoism and Buddhism. So, very small or minorities practice Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Sikhism. So, to the next one, the native religion of Japan is Shinto, which developed in prehistoric times. So it is polytheistic faith, emphasizing the divinity of the natural world. So Shintoism does not have a holy book or founder. And most Japanese Buddhists belong to the Mahayana school, which came to Japan from Baekje, Korea in the 6th century. So in Japan, Shinto and Buddhist practices are combined into a single religion, with Buddhist temples being built at the sites of important Shinto shrines. So let's talk about the geography. So the Japanese archipelago includes more than 3,000 islands, covering a total area of 377,835 square kilometers. So the four main islands from north to south are Hokkaido, Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu. So basically, Japan is largely mountainous and forested, with land making up only 11.66% of the country. So the highest point is Mount Fuji at 3,776 meters, and or 12,385 feet. So the lowest point is Hachero Gata, which sits at 4 meters below sea level, or 12 feet. So positioned astride the Pacific Ring of Fire, Japan features a number of hydrothermal features such as geysers and hot springs. Japan also suffers frequent earthquake, tsunamis, and volcanic eruption. There are climates stretching 3,500 kilometers from north to south. So Japan includes a number of different climate zones. It has a temperate climate overall with 4 seasons. So heavy snowfall is the rule in the winter on the northern island of Hokkaido. In 1970, the town of Kuchan received 312 centimeter, over 10 feet of snow in a single day. And the southern island of Okinawa, in contrast, has a semi-tropical climate with an average annual temperature of 20 Celsius. So their economy, Japan is one of the most technologically advanced societies on earth, as I've also made mention earlier. As a result, it has the world's third largest economy by GDP after the US and China. So Japanese exports include automobiles, consumers and office electronics, steel, and transportation equipment. Imports include food, oil, lumber, and metal ores. So economic growth stalled in the 1990s, but since has rebounded to quietly respectable 2% per year. So per capita GDP is in Japan is $38 dollars, or 38 $440, or 16.1% of the population lives below the poverty line. Moving on, early Japanese history is traditionally divided into 5 major eras: the Paleolithic, Jomon, Yayoi, Kofun, and Yamato periods. So it is very clear that early Japan underwent profound changes in each of those important periods. So let's dive in. Japan was settled about 35,000 years ago by Paleolithic people from the Asian mainland. So the source of this information will be put under the reference. So the Paleolithic period, 50,000 BC to 12,000 BC. So facts are, the first human beings to inhabit the islands we know as Japan appear to have been Stone Age hunters from Northeast Asia, and small groups during this time or period were traveling using stone-tipped weapons. So they followed wild animals, including elephants, mammoths, and deer across land bridges to Japan that had formed when the seas receded during the ice ages. So Paleolithic artifacts include finely made blade tools similar to groups in Siberia and the rest of Eurasia, and axes made from ground stones. Since no pottery has yet been discovered during on that period, the Paleolithic period in Japan is also sometimes referred to as the pre-ceramic, or in Japan word Sendoki period. So this helps distinguish its inhabitants from those of the following eras. So basically, it was during this that period that yield a wide variety of Paleolithic tools. These include both core tools made by chipping away the surface of stone, and flake tools made by working with a stone flake broken off from a larger piece of stone. So, and to the next one, we have the Jomon period. So, 11,000 BC to 300. So, about 20,000 years ago, the world's fourth and most recent ice age ended. So, as the climate warmed, the polar ice caps melted and the sea levels rose. So, the land bridges that had provided walkways for such Paleolithic inhabitants of Japan as giant woolly mammoths, deer, and humans were submerged for the final time. The islands of Honshu and Hokkaido were again separated, and Japan was once more isolated geographically. So as Japan became hotter, it reached its peak about 3000 BC. Animals such as the woolly mammoth that had traditionally been hunted died out, but fortunately other plants and animals did better, and new, more sophisticated civilization began to emerge during this period. So this new stage in Japanese history is known as the Jomon, literally cord pattern period, because it is characterized by the appearance of the earthenware pottery that often decorated with marks and swirling designs impressed by sticks, bamboo, vines, or rope. So in Middle Jomon and Late Jomon, 2500 BC to 1500 BC, typically had elaborate designs, and by later Jomon, large stone jarwars were made, perhaps for infant burial and religious offerings, while carved stone and clay figures known as dugu became increasingly elaborate. So there were a lot of contribution during this period. So the Yayoi period. In 1884, some distinctive pottery, so clearly different in style and technique from Jomon pots, was unearthed in the Yayoi district of modern Tokyo. So this district gave its name to a relatively brief but decisive period of Japanese culture in which late Jomon culture was overlaid with a new and more advanced culture based not only on new pottery forms but also the mining, smelting, and casting of bronze and iron. So there were also irrigation and cultivation of rice in this period. So Yaya culture varied by region, but overall was a culture unique to Japan. It has been traditionally dated from 300 BC to 300 AD, but scholars now think that it developed from at least 800 or 900 BC to 250 AD. So basically, the rice cultivation was one of its focus. So rice cultivation was one characteristic of the period. So rice had been grown in Yangtze River in China from at least 5000 BC and in Korea from about 1500 BC, but apparently did not reach Japan until about 300 AD. So probably small groups of immigrants from the continent brought rice cultivation techniques to Japan, where they and the Jomon peoples began to prepare special fields that had ample supplies of water and developed the necessarily seeding, weeding, and harvesting skills. So the earliest fields were natural wetlands, but gradually the Yayoi people learned to construct irrigation canals that could supply the right amount of water to round out their diet. That the Yayoi people also gathered wild plants, cultivated fruit, hunted, and fished. So Yayoi pottery also reflected technological improvements. So it was during the period that the improvements in technology, especially in the aspect of planting and cultivation, were rich in a lot of preparation, a lot of sacrifices, and a lot of improvements. Next, we have the Kofun period, 300 AD to 552 AD. So by 250 AD, the building of large tomb became so strikingly different from what had gone on before that the period from around 250 AD to the introduction of Buddhism in 552 AD is now commonly called the Kofun or Old Tomb period. So these tombs reflect the power of an extensive political regime. So they have been found from southern Kyushu to northern Honshu. So it was during this period that shapes varied from a round to square to K-hole shape. So one striking example, the alleged tomb of Emperor Nintoku, who may have ruled in the early 400 near modern Osaka. So, except for the extraordinary tomb of the first emperor of the Qin dynasty in China, it is bigger than all of the tomb of the world. So, the Yamato period, 552 AD to 710 AD. So, the number and the size of these tombs suggest that by the 5th and the 6th centuries, Japanese society was becoming more sophisticated as it did so. A shifting confederation of intermarried tribal chieftains began in this period to call itself the Yamato people. So Yamato refers both the area around Nara and the clan that eventually founded the present-day imperial line in Japan. So particularly in literary works, the word is also often used to refer to Japan as a whole. So Yamato society was organized into clans known as uji, occupation, groups, and slaves. So because of their traditional power, loyalty, and service, the Yamato court, the Suga, Mononobe, and Nakatomi clans were given special titles and allowed to be in attendance at the newly forming imperial court. They made themselves useful by performing both state duties and religious worship.
Asuka period from 592 to 710 is a little understood period when Japanese culture was developing and defining itself, and the first powerful centralized Japanese state was established during this period. So Asuka is the name of the ancient city near Nara, where the kingdom was centered. So, the capital of Japan from 694 to 710 was nearby in Fujiwara. So, the Asuka period began with accession of Empress Soiko to the Japanese throne in 592 and the establishment of Toyora Palace. So it ended when Empress Gen Mei relocated the capital to Heiokya or Nara in AD 710. So the Asuka period is one of the first eras in Japanese history we know a lot about because this is the first time they started keeping written records of their own. The concept of writing entered Japan from China and Korea. So this is also the era which Buddhism, okay, one of the religions, first flourished in Japan. So which also entered from China and Korea, originally from India. So overall, the Asuka period was an era when Japanese, of course, imported um, ideas from foreign nations, observed them, and began the process of transforming them into something uniquely Japanese. So even the name of Japan at this time reflected this. So the island previously called itself Hua, but in the Asuka era adopted the name Nippon. The name came from the Japanese description of Japan as the land of the rising sun. And definitely that's what Japan calls itself up till until of this day. So historically, Asuka period focuses on the development in architecture, painting, and sculpture. So, the underlying themes of their arts are all influenced by foreign ideas. Of those ideas, Buddhism was the most transformative during um, um, in that period. Next one, we have the Nara period, so 710 to 784. So it was in this period that the beginning with the establishment of the new imperial capital at Nara in 710. The Nara period marked the incipient stage of the classical era of Japanese history. So it was during this period that imperial power was cemented and the dogma of imperial succession from the sun goddess Amaterasu was codified in the Kuijiki and Nihon Shoki. So the Nara period was also marked by the development of two powerful schools of Buddhism, the Tendai and the more esoteric Shingon, and the ascendancy of the Buddhism in general. So the era came to an end when the Emperor Kanmu decided to move the capital shortly after the death of the Empress Koki. Next, we have the Heian period. In this period, it is considered one of the culturally richest epochs in Japanese history. The Heian period saw the zenith of court high culture. It is also saw the inception of the nascent samurai or bushi class, and ascendancy would eventually spell the end of Japan's guild age when the Taira and Minamoto clans fought each other in the Genpei War. So this period saw some of Japan's most lasting art, including Murasaki Shikubu's Tale of Genji and Sei Shonagon's The Bellow Book Makura, as well as move away from Chinese-style ink painting and towards the more colorful Yamato-e style. So basically, as a result of this and other artistic achievement, the Heian period is still regarded fondly by many Japanese as the high watermark of Japanese culture. As you can see on the PowerPoint, there is a timeline under feudal era. So there are periods, and I will still give background information on what I have found out on the internet. So Kamakura period, 1185 to 1333. So it is stated that with the defeat of the Taira clan in the Janpei War, political power shifted again, this time to the victorious Minamoto. So Minamoto is the leader. So who had himself declared shogun. So under Minamoto rule, Japan entered its nearly 700-year feudal period, and the imperial court was relegated to a still symbolically important but effectively marginal and ceremonial role. So early in the Kamakura period, the shogun rather, himself saw his power reduced when the Hojo family, or the descendants of a branch of the Taira clan that had allied itself with the Minamoto at the outset of the Genpei War. So it established a regency that effectively took control of the country at Minamoto hands. So it was during that period that saw a short lived attempt by Kublai Khan and his Mongol hordes to invade Japan. So next we have Muromachi period, also called as Ashikaga period in Japanese history. So period of Ashikaga shogunate 1338 to 1573. So the development of the great Zen monasteries in Kamakura and Kyoto had a great influence on the visual arts of the Muromachi period. So these are the key takeaways. So the foremost painter of the new Sumi-e style was Sashu Toryu, 1420 to 1506. So whose most dramatic works were completed in the Chinese splash Habuku style. Um, the Sumi style was highly influenced by calligraphy, employing the same tools and style as well as its Zen philosophy. So by the end of the 14th century, monochrome landscape paintings and Soiga had found patronage by the ruling Ashika family and were preferred genre among Zen painters. So there are a lot of styles in this period. The artistry, or it is the innovation of arts. A lot of paintings, pottery were seen as inherently connected. So the last one we have the Edo period. In the Edo or Tokugawa period between 1603 to 1868, Japan was under the rule of the Tokugawa shogunate, a form of military rule headed by the shogun. The period was characterized by economic growth, strict social order, isolationist foreign policies, increased environmental protection, and population enjoyment of the arts. So it was officially established in Edo on March 24, 1603 by Tokugawa Ieyasu. So basically the period came to an end with the Meiji Restoration on May 3, 1868 after the fall of Edo to forces loyal to the emperor. So one of the dominant themes in Edo period was the repressive um, policies of the shogunate and at the attempts of the artists to escape these strictures. So the foremost of these strictures was the closing of the country to foreigners and the imposition of the strict codes of behavior affecting many aspects of life, including the clothes one wore, the person one married, and the activities one could or should not pursue. So, in the early years of Edo period, however, the full impact of Tokugawa policies had not yet been felt, and some Japan's finest expressions in architecture and painting were produced by the Renpa.
Okay, next we have feudal era. So feudal Japan had a four-tiered social structure based on the principle of military preparedness. So at the top were the daimyo and their samurai retainers. So three varieties of commoners stood below the samurai. We have farmers, craftsmen, and merchants. So other people were excluded entirely from the hierarchy and assigned to unpleasant or unclean duties such as leather tanning, butchering animals, and executing condemned criminals. So they are politely known as burakumin or people of the village. So in its basic outline, this system seems very rigid and absolute. So, however, the system was both more fluid and more interesting than the short description implies. So, along this presentation, we are going to know the examples of how the feudal Japanese social system actually function in people's daily lives. So, if a woman from a common family got engaged to a samurai, she could be officially adopted by a second samurai family. So, these circumvented the ban or commoners and samurai intermarrying. So, next, when a horse, ox, or other large farm animal died, it basically became the property of the local outcast. So it did not matter if the animal had been the personal property of a farmer or if its body was on a daimyo's land. Once it was dead, only the eta had any right to it. So the third one, we have for more than 200 years from 1600s to 1868, the entire Japanese social structure revolved around support of the samurai military establishment. So it was during that time period there were no major wars. Most samurai served as bureaucrats. Next, we have the samurai class basically live on a form of social security. So they were basically paid a set stipend and in rise and did not get raises for cost of living increases. So as a result, some samurai families had to turn to the manufacture of small goods like umbrellas or toothpicks to make a living. So to surpass a day of hunger, to surpass their everyday everyday needs, their necessities. So they would secretly pass these items on to peddlers to sell. So next facts, although there were separate laws for the samurai class, most laws applied to all three types of commoners equally. Samurai and commoners even had different kinds of mailing addresses. So the commoners were identified by which imperial province they live in, while samurai were identified by which daimyo's domain they serve. So commoners who tried unsuccessfully to commit suicide because of love were considered criminals, but they could not be executed. So basically that would just give them their wish, right? So they became outcasts, non-persons, or hinin instead. So next, being an outcast wasn't necessarily a grinding existence. So one headman of the Edo Tokyo outcasts named Danzaemon wore two swords like a samurai and enjoyed the privileges normally associated with the minor daimyo. So, to maintain the distinction between samurai and commoners, the government conducted raids called sword hunts or katanagari. So, commoners discovered with sword, firearms would be put to death. Of course, this also discouraged peasant uprisings. So commoners were not allowed to have surnames, family names, unless they had been awarded one for special service to their daimyo. Although the Kita class of outcasts was associated with the disposal of animal carcasses and the execution of criminals, most actually made their living by farming. So their unclean duties were just a sideline. Still, they could not be considered in the same class as commoner farmers because they were outcasts. So people with Hansen disease, also called leprosy, live segregated in the Hinin community. However, on the Lunar New Year and Midsummer's Eve, they would go out into the city to perform Minoyishi. It is a celebration ritual in front of people's homes. So blind Japanese remain into the class of which they were born. So samurai, farmer, etc. So long as they stayed in the family home, if they ventured out to work as storytellers, beggars, then they had to join the blind persons guild, which was a self-governing social group outside of the four-tier system. So some commoners called Gomyun took off the role of wandering performers, and beggars would formerly have been within the outcast domain.
So our next topic is all about the Ashikaga Shogunate. Ashikaga Shogunate, or in Japanese, Ashikaga Bakufu in 1336 to 1573, also known as the Muromachi Shogunate, or the Muromachi Bakufu. It was the feudal military government of Japan during the Muromachi period from 1336 to 1573. So, the beginning of Ashikaga rule in 1180 to 1185, during the Kamakura era, Japan was ruled by a branch of an ancient Taira clan which lost the Genpei War to the Minamoto clan, but it managed to seize the power. Then the Ashikaga, in turn, was a branch of the Minamoto clan. In 1185 to 1334, the roots of Ashikaga power goes back even before the Kamakura period, which preceded the Ashikaga Shogunate. In 1336, Ashikaga Taukaji established his own shogunate in Kyoto. The Ashikaga Shogunate is also sometimes known as a Muromachi Shogunate because the shogun's place was in the Muromachi district of Kyoto. Ashikaga Taukaji overthrew the Kamakura Shogunate, in effect defeating the Taira once more and returning the Minamoto to power. So the period between 1336 and 1392 is known as the Northern and Southern Kurds era because Japan had two emperors at the same time. So in 1338, The period marks the governance of the Muromachi, or what you called Ashikaga Shogunate, which was officially established by the first Muromachi shogun, which is Ashikaga Taukaji, in 2 years after the brief Kenmu restoration, year 1333 to 1336 of imperial rule was brought to a close. In terms of international relations, the Ashikaga shoguns sent frequent diplomatic and trade missions to Joseon, Korea, and also used the daimyo to Tsushima Island as an intermediary. The Ashikaga letters were addressed to the King of Korea from the King of Japan, indicating an equal relationship, but not only in Korea. Japan also carried an active trade relationship with Ming China. So China's Confucian distaste for trade dictated that they disguise the trade as a tribute coming from Japan in exchange for gifts from the Chinese emperor. So both Ashikaga Japan and Joseon Korea established this tributary relationship with Ming China. But what I've said, Japan also traded with Southeast Asia. They are sending copper, swords, and furs in exchange for exotic woods and spices. Even though that Ashikaga Japan and Joseon Korea established this tributary relationship with Ming China, and also Japan traded with Southeast Asia, the Ashikaga shoguns were also weak. So here is the Ashikaga dynasty overthrown. The clan did not have a large home domain of its own, so it lacked the wealth and power of Kamakura or the later Tokugawa shoguns. That lasting influence of the Ashikaga era is in the arts and culture of Japan. So during this period, the samurai class enthusiastically embraced Zen Buddhism, which had been imported from China as early as 7th century. So the military elites developed an entire aesthetic based on Zen ideas about beauty, nature, simplicity, and utility. And also arts, including the tea ceremony, painting, garden design, the floral arranging, and non-theater, all developed along the Zen lines. So in between 1336 and 1573, the Ashikaga shogunate ruled Japan. However, it was not a strong central governing force, and in fact, that Ashikaga Bakufu witnessed the rise of powerful daimyo all around the country. And these regional lords reigned over their domains with very little interference or very little influence from the shogun in Kyoto. So this period ended in 1573 when the 15th and last shogun of this line, Ashikaga Yoshiaki, was driven out of the capital in Kyoto by Oda Nobunaga. So our next topic is all about Tokugawa shogunate. So since the Ashikaga shogunate ended, the late Tokugawa shogunate was the period between 1853 and 1867, during which Japan ended its isolationist foreign policy called Sakuku and modernized from a feudal shogunate to the Meiji government. So it is at the end of the Edo period and preceded the Meiji era. So can you imagine if your country shut of all influence or shut out all influence and trade from the outside world, except maybe a couple nearby countries? So in 200 years later, what would it be like? So in this period, Japan went through just this during the Tokugawa shogunate. So the Tokugawa shogunate, which is sometimes also known as the Edo period, was the last medieval government in Japan, just before the modernization of the Meiji Restoration. So that being said, just because the Meiji Restoration was an era of modernization, it does not mean that Japan during the Tokugawa shogunate was primitive. During this close to 200-year period, the rulers called shoguns helped keep Japan in long period of peace and influenced the health and power of the emerging merchant class, and also helped to increase the number of people living in urban cities. So the shoguns also worked to try and protect Japan from Western influences and especially the Christianity. So next is the rise of the Tokugawa shogunate. So by the 1500s, much of the power in Japan was heavily divided, and also the feudal lords fought among themselves. So in year 1543 and 1616, one lord named Tokugawa Ieyasu was able to put an end to all the fighting when he won the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600. Ieyasu used his victory to consolidate the power of the lords under himself. So he was able to rule in this new system from his seat of power in Edo, or modern day of Tokyo. So he was named the first official shogun in 1603. Thus, the beginning of Tokugawa shogunate in 1603 to 1616, during his reign, that of his son, which is Hidetada, and also his grandson, Iemitsu. The shoguns were able to unify almost all political power in Japan under them. So, also, they prevent any of the local lords from amassing too much power. So, distrusting of Western Europe and its influence, the shoguns worked tirelessly to prevent too much Western influence in Japan. So this also meant a strong avoidance of anything to do with the Christianity, and eventually it led to a complete ban on all Christian missionaries entering the country. So instead of the dominant religion in Japan was Confucianism, and this suspicion of the Western would also affected the Japanese trade. So in 1636, after the act of seclusion in Japan, it did not trade at all with Western countries for the next 200 years, with only a few small exceptions. So they preferred to trade with other East Asian countries, especially China and Korea. So here, the Tokugawa shogunate economy. So Japan at this time relied on its agricultural produce, or their agricultural product, and their primary crops was rice. But Japan also had a strong hold in crops such as the sesame seed oil, the indigo, the sugarcane, the mulberry, tobacco, and cotton. So as a result, the economy of Japan, commerce, and manufacturing economies were growing, leading to a rise in urban culture like cities, Kyoto, Osaka, and Edo grew quickly under the shogunate. But take note that the Tokugawa shogunate only lasted from year 1603 to 1867. That's all. Thank you.
So, hello everyone, and today we will discuss about the classical contribution of the Japan in civilization. So, the Shinto religion in its architecture, distinctive art objects such as Haniwa figurines, the oldest pottery vessels in the world, the largest wooden buildings anywhere at the time of their construction, and many literary classics, including the world first novel, were all unique contributions to world culture in ancient Japan. So this article and this discussion is about Japan's civilization, including its religion, literature, art, that it only provides historical review. So although China and Korea had a significant influence on Japan, the islands were never subject to foreign political control and were thus to choose ideas that appeals to them, adopt them as they fit, and continue with their indigenous control practices to create a unique approach to government, religion, and arts. The Hamon period, firstly, the name of the period comes from a distinctive pottery produced at the time. So it was the oldest vessel which have simple rope decorations, or hamon. So the appearance of this pottery marks the end of the previous period, the Paleolithic age, when people traveled across now long bridges from mainland Asia to to southern Japanese island. The production of pottery did not necessarily indicate the existence of communities in fixed settlements. However, the majority of the period, people have to continue to live a hunter-gatherer existence using wood and stone tools. As according to genetic evidences, the new immigrants conquered or integrated with the indigenous people, merging the pottery, bronze, iron, and improved metalworking techniques that resulted in more efficient farming tools as well as better weaponry armor. With improved agricultural management, the society was able to develop with specialized trades and professions, and thus markets for trade, ritual practices utilizing distinctive items such as the Ducato bronze cell, social classes of varying prosperity, and an established ruling class to govern over alliances of clans groups that eventually formed small kingdoms. Common period artifacts discovered include the clay, stone, human-shaped figurines, clay masks, stone rods, and clay, stone, and jade jewelry beads, and of course, earrings. Archaeology has also revealed that Hamon erected stone circles, lines of stones forming arrow shapes, and single tall standing stones surrounding by a cluster of smaller stones. So the major political event of the Asoka period occurred in the 645 CE. So the new government was restored along Chinese line in the series of a long-lasting reform known as the Taika Reform, in which land was nationalized, taxes were to be paid in kind rather than labor, social ranks were reclassified, civil services and trans-examinations were introduced, law codes were written, and the emperor's absolute authority was established. So the introduction of Buddhism to Japan sometime in the 16th century CE, traditionally in 552 CE, was perhaps the most significant development of the Asuka period. Emperor Yomi officially adopted it, and Prince Shokoto, who built several impressive temples such as the Yoriji, encouraged it further. Buddhism was generally welcomed by Japan's elite because it contributed to Japan's cultural status as developed nations of their powerful neighbors. The central government control over the provinces was threatened by a stronger military presence throughout Japan's island, and Buddhism was spread further by Emperor Shōmu's project of building of temple in every province, a plan that increased taxation to exorbitant level. Others is major temples were also constructed in Nara, such as the Todaiji with its great Buddha hall. So the world's longest wooden structure containing the world's largest bronze sculpture of Buddha, Shinto, was represented by the Kasuga Taishi Shrine in forest outside the capital and the Fujimi Inari Taisha Shrine near Kyoto, among others. So Japan also became more optimistic international, establishing close ties with the state in northern Korea, and over the decades, Japan sent 30 diplomatic embassies and 35 balhae in return. So Japan exported textiles like fur, silk, hemp cloth, and trade flourished. So the Nara period produced what are arguably the two most famous and important works of Japanese literature ever written, the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki histories, which contain a creation myth, Shinto gods, and royal genealogy. So there was also the Manyoshu poetry analogy, so Japan's first of many, which was published around the year 760 years ago. So the city also had the aristocratic places. A large pleasure was built south of the royal palace, and foreign affairs, Japan became somewhat liberal after 838 CE, with no need defend in borders engaged in theoretical conquest. However, the sporadic trade and cultural exchanges with other countries continued as before. Medicines, works, silk fabrics, books, ceramics, weapons, and musical instruments were imported from China, while Japan sent back pearls, gold dust, amber, raw silk, and gilt lacquerware. So monks, scholars, students, and musicians and artists were dispatched to China to see what they could learn from the country. Still no more advanced culture. So the Japanese period is recognized for its cultural achievement, which include the development of Japanese writing system based on Chinese characters, mostly phonetical, allowing the production of the world's first novel, The Tale of Genji by Murasaki. So, of course, screen painting, hand scrolls of pictures and texts, and fine calligraphy were among the visuals art represented. Painters and sculptures continued to be inspired by Buddhism, but a more wholly Japanese appearance gradually continued to be inspired by Buddhism. So now, to sum it up, Japanese civilization brought aspects of traditional culture, such as the writing classic Confucian texts, Buddhism, weaving, religion, the architecture, the irrigation, as well as, of course, the other architectural ideas that envoys were also sent to different countries, such as China, and more times until 502 CE, while the Yamato Japan was establishing a diplomatic presence of the international stage. Okay, so now we were in the second topic, which is Japan in 1853, the Perry Expedition. So the Perry Expedition, it is the arrival of black sheep. It was a diplomatic and military expedition to the Tokugawa Shinigami that involved two separate voyages by U.S. Navy warship in 1853 to 54. So the expedition goals included exploration, surveying, and the establishment of diplomatic relations and negotiation of trade agreements with various nations in the region. Establishing contact with the government of Japan was a top priority of the expedition and was one of the primary reasons for its inception. So, President Millard Fillmore directed the expedition, which was led by the Commodore Matthew Calvert Perry. So Perry's primary goal was to force to an end to Japan's 220 years old isolation policy and open Japanese ports to American trade, even if it meant using gunboat diplomacy. So the Perry expedition directly resulted in the establishment of diplomatic relations between Japan and the Western great powers, as well as the eventual demise of the ruling Tokugawa Shinigami and the restoration of the emperor. So following the expedition, Japan's expanding trade routes with the rest of the world gave rise to the Japanese subcultural trend, in which aspect of Japanese culture influenced art in Europe and America. So the first visit to Japan back took place between 1852 and 1853. So Perry and other high-ranking American seamen are depicted in a Japanese woodblock print. So Perry chose the block-hulled paddle-wheeled Mississippi as he flagship and set sail from the Hampton Roads, Virginia on November 24, 1852. So Perry made port calls in Madeira, between the month of December, between the days of 11 and 15. So St. Helena, January 10 to 11, Cape Town to January 24 and February 3. So Martes, February 18 to 28, and the Ceylon March is 10 to 15, as Singapore is March 25 to 29, and Macau and Hong Kong is April 7 to 28. So there he met with the American-born sinologist Samuel Wells Williams, who had traveled to Japan with Morrison in 1837, and received Chinese language translation of Perry's official letter, as well as the rendezvous with the Plymouth Saratoga went on the Shanghai, where he met the Anton Portman, a Dutch-born American diplomat who translated his official letters. So Perry then changed his flag to the Soksihana and visit by Ryoko Island from May 17 to May 26. So ignoring Sachuman Domain's claims to the island in his own orders, he threatened bluffed local authorities by threatening to attack with 200 troops unless he was granted trading rights and land for cooling station. Perry landed in Marines and dominated an audience with the King Shing Tai or Shari Castle, which he drilled on a beach for hours at a time, knowing that every move he made would be reported to Japanese authorities. So Perry's expedition left with promises that the islands would be completely open to trade with the U.S. In mid-June, Perry returned to the Ogasawa Island and met the locals, even purchasing a plot of land. On July 1853, Perry arrived in Oroga, Japan, at the entrance to Edo Bay. At the time, his fleet consisted of 4 ships in Susquehanna, the Mississippi, the Plymouth, and the Saratoga. And as soon as he arrived, Perry ordered his ships to steam past Japanese lines toward Edo's capital and positioned their guns toward the towns of Oroga. He also fired blank shots from his 37 canoes, claiming it was the honor of the American Independence Day. So following Perry's departure, the Shonagal court held a lengthy debate on how to respond to the American implied threats. Abe believed that it was currently impossible for Japan to resist American demands militarily, but he was hesitant to act on his own. So authority in such a predictable situation, in order to legitimize any decision, Abe pulled all the claimies for their thoughts. This was the first time that Tokugawa allowed public debate on its decision, which had unintended consequences of portraying the Shinigami as weak and indecisive. So the poll results also failed to provide within answers. As of 19 of 21 known responses were in favor. And all to sum it up, the purpose of expedition was to open the port of Japan for trades to within other countries, specifically US and Europe. And that ends my 2 discussion about the contribution of the Japanese civilization and of course the Japan in 1853.
Good morning, everyone. So today I'll be discussing about Meiji Restoration, Sino-Japanese War, and Russo-Japanese War. So first, we need to explore the Meiji Restoration. Now, what is Meiji Restoration? Meiji Restoration was a coup act that resulted in the dissolution of Japan's feudal system of government and the restoration of imperial system. So Meiji Restoration was made to end up the Japan's feudal system of governing. So feudal system is talking about how the how the leaders or the lords or the merchants run lands and then give it to the farmers in exchange with their military service. So also, Meiji Restoration is made to restore the imperial system. So before the feudalism, there is a imperial system that is happening within Japan, and then during the Tokugawa or the Edo period, feudal system was made, and then so to go back to the way they had before, they need to restore the imperial system. That is why Meiji Restoration was happening. Now, why is it named as a Meiji Restoration? So when Tokugawa Shogun, the great general in 1868, lost his power, an emperor took over and restored the supreme position. So Tokugawa Shogun is the leader or the great general during the feudalism system. That's the Edo period. And then when he lost his power because of some rebellion that is happening within those Edo years, an emperor took over and restored the imperialism during the Meiji Restoration. Now he took the name Meiji, which means to enlighten or rule, as his reign name. This event was known as Meiji Restoration, a powerful army and navy, because imperialism or imperial system is talking about extension of domination from one place to the other. So more like what do you call that? Mag-extend sila sa ilang power. So murag sakop, mura siya pananakop in Filipino or Tagalog version. So, what are the timeline events or the significant events that are happening during Meiji Restoration, beforehand Meiji Restoration, and going to also Japanese? We have Edo period, that's before the Meiji Restoration years, that is happening 1603 to 1867. Then Treaty of Kanagawa, which is proposed by someone who is interested or pursuing Japan to open their ports, because they've been isolating themselves for about 200 years. So they signed Treaty of Kanagawa to open their ports. And then transition to Meiji. There are things that is happening after opening the ports of Japan, and that becomes the transition of Meiji. And then Meiji Constitution is promulgated, that's 1889. And then Sino-Japanese War, that's war between Chinese and Japan. Russo-Japanese War, that's war between Russia and Japan. It is because of domination, and that is because of the imperial system being made by the Meiji Restoration. So, what really happens during Edo period? Okay, so during Edo period, this period expands from 1603 to 1967. This is the final era or the last era of traditional Japanese cultures, government, and society. So during this period, the Japanese are very strict and very conservative about Confucianism. They want all or yeah the whole country to practice Confucianism. The cultures, the government, the tradition should be focused on the traditional way of what Japanese is. So in that time, they are closing their ports from the Western influence, from the other countries' influence, because they only want their culture to be preserved through 2 centuries that they are having during Edo period. And then also they are practicing feudalism governing, wherein the lords and the merchants are having this kind of land, and then they give it to the people. In return, those farmers or those people who are working on those lands that were given by the merchants will serve or will give their military service to the society. And then that's presiding for about 250 years of peace and prosperity in the country, including the rise of the merchant class, that's the people who owns the land, and then increasing of urbanization, guarding the society from Western influences. Especially that during the Edo period, the people here are only wants Confucianism. So there is actually a year. There is actually it's 1637 to 1638, wherein shogunate's brutal repression of Christian rebelling on the Shimabara Peninsula. So the shogunates or the leader, that's the great general during Edo period, who kills how many Christians? There are about 300,000 Christians that time, and because Christians, dominant, Japanese are conservative and they wanted Confucianism only be practiced, so they killed about 300,000 Christians on that time. Conserving religion with strong emphasis on loyalty and duty. So they killed the Christians. So it's more like they ending up the imperialism, they ending up the Christianism, and they ending up the Western influences during the Edo period. So who led? Um, kinsa man ang great general, or who was more like president or somewhat a leader during the Edo period? It's the General Tokugawa Ieyasu, that's Ieyasu, who leads for about 1543 to 1616. So Ieyasu won the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600s and was named as shogun. Shogun means supreme military leader in 1603 as named after the largely powerless imperial courts appointed by the emperor. So before the Edo period, nasa like imperialism. So katong previous emperor, that's the one who runs the imperialism society, iyang gi-appoint si Ieyasu, Tokugawa Ieyasu, to lead the next generation or the next timeline of governing, which is practicing feudalism governing. So he banned all the imyos, that's the lords, to the shogunate, the military, and limits any individual daimyo from acquiring too much land or power. As what I'd said, see, during feudalism, they are making the people make service to military in exchange to the land that were given by the merchant. So during Ieyasu's leadership, he lords and militaries are different people, and then they banned them. But to the imyos or the lords, naglimit po siya nila on not getting too much power or domination or mandating too much to the farmers or the people who works to the lands. So during the time of Ieyasu, he is the most powerful shogun. He is the most powerful military during the Edo period or the Tokugawa period. Continuation about Tokugawa Edo period. So during that period, the people are divided into four classes, which are the warriors, that's the military, artisans, the people who are conserving the arts of them, somehow like the kabuki theater, wherein katuning mga theater nga kamantay mo atong mag-paint sila sa face, that if you have read kind of thing, kay nag-emphasize ka sa character nga bad or negative. And then we have the haiku and tanaka, the very traditional kind of poetry that the Japanese had. And then farmers, the people who serves or gives military service in exchange with the lands that were given by the lords or the merchants, the people who owns the land that were worked by the farmers. So in the division of these four classes, dili sila pwede mugawa sa ilahong role. Kung imong role sa society, farmer ka, dili ka pwedeng mag-own og land, then magpa-trabaho atong imong yuta. So kung farmer ka. Kung military ka. Kung warrior ka. So, dili ka pwede mula pa sa imong role sa imong society during the Tokugawa period or the Edo period. So, during this time, very divided ang classes of people. Of course, there is a big possibility na the economy will grow significantly. Kay gitaro mo siya tunga, ang farmer mo, kanisya, kanana. So, there is an industry, the industries are expanded, people grow rice. No, it's only the merchant class who get rich and wealthy during that time. And then the rise of the kabuki theater, Banuaki puppet, literature, the Hanaka and haiku, and then gunbak printing. Next, okay, what are the significant events during the Edo period? So, in mid-18th to 19th century, peasants uprising during the famine days. So, before that, what is famine days? Famine days is the days wherein tagutom, or like, very least of resources for food or survival things or stuff. So during the famine days, daghan ng nag-rebel, or there is an uprising rebellion between the classes versus the merchants. Because as what I said before, ang merchants ra ang nadato during the Edo period, and it's very unfair to all of the classes. So then, naay rebellion nga nahitabo during the mid-18th to 19th century, which is also a famine days. After that one, there is the Treaty of Kanagawa. Okay, so Treaty of Kanagawa was being negotiated by the American Commodore Matthew Perry. So during the feudalism or the Edo period, nanay mga leaders from any other nations who are really interested in what's happening within Japan because they are isolating themselves from other countries. So nanay sa kailang nahitabo sa Japan ron, and they've been interested because during that period, taas kayo ang changes sa Japan, and as what I said, there is an na the industries are being expanded, they're being so productive of their isolation. So daghan kayo ang interested. Also, these kind of countries kay nagbalik-balik sila support sa Japan because they wanted to end the isolation of the Japanese. So here we go, proposed by Matthew Perry because he negotiates with this Treaty of Kanagawa. So after then, the Japanese signed the Treaty of Kanagawa, emphasizing the end or disbanding the 2-century-old isolation policy. So, kay disband naman nila ang ilang isolation policy. It's almost or more than 200 years of isolation from any other country. So, ilang gi-open nilang ports. Pwede nang magpasulod o mga Western people or any other countries who wanted to go inside Japan. And then, especially to American ships. So they guarantee their safe harbor and allow them to set up a permanent consultation exchange for not bombing Edo or Tokyo. Edo is a place or the center now named as Tokyo. So ilang gi-open ang port sa Japan to end the isolation and also to give American permanent consultation for not para what do you call this one, in exchange of not bombing the Tokyo. Okay, so by 1867, Tokugawa Keiki or Tokugawa Yoshinobu, that's the last shogun, resigns, ending the Tokugawa shogunate and helps restore the power of the emperor. So, wait, diba? Like, open naman ang Japanese ports. So, when welcome naman sila mga Western influence, there are a lot of changes happening within the Japan. So, nana siya transition papunta sa Meiji. And the last military leader, which is Tokugawa Keiki, resigns, ending the Tokugawa shogunate. So he ends the feudalism when he resigns because shogunates are the military leaders. So siya man ang last military leader, siya po ang nag-end sa feudalism. And this is a great transition in restoring the power of the emperor. So mura after resigning, after nag-resign si Keiki, gibalik na niya ang emperor's power. There is a transition to Meiji Restoration. So during the Meiji Restoration, leaders were young, pragmatic policies, and power was tenuous. So during the transition of Meiji Restoration, the leaders were young, pragmatic. They got the pragmatic policies, and the power was tenuous. First, the leaders were young because during this era, it was led by only 15 or 14-year-old emperor and was having, pero kay he's too young, so he was having these kind of more like cabinets in ours. No, not cabinets, but more like advisors that is aging about 40 something that helps him in leading the whole country on the time of Meiji. And then they got the pragmatic policies because they don't usually preserve the Confucianism. So they actually discourage Confucianism at that time because na naman ay Western influences in that time. So maybe okay rin nila ang Christianity or any other religious influences that the Western gave to them. And then they abolished the division of classes. Remember, the artisans, the merchants, the military, farmers. Ilan ang gi-abolish. And then ilang gi-disband ang feudal system, which means that they are now practicing imperial system. And then, so during 1868, the Charter Oath was written. Why? Because before Tokugawa Keiki surrendered, may nahitabo nga war between Japanese and Japanese, and that is called Bushin War, wherein this group of Japanese are loyalists of Tokugawa or Edo period. And then here comes nga, nag-open na ang Japan port. So, nanay tay mga people who are against the Tokugawa. So, they fight together, and that war is called Bushin War. However, surrender ang mga loyalists ni Keiki or mga loyalists sa Tokugawa. And that kind of war made it to the oath of Charter Oath, and was written to promise unify the classes and seek knowledge from around the world in order to strengthen the imperial rule. So muna ni pagperma nila sa Charter Oath, or dili, pag-oath nila sa Charter Oath, they promise nga there would be no war between peoples and they will unify everyone. Also, to gain knowledge mo, travel sila all around the world to gain knowledge from those people para mas strengthen nila ang emperor's rule. And that actually really happened. By 1871 to 1873, there is a activities that they have been doing. They've been sending 50 members group to negotiate and study institutions. How does school works? How does any other people lead or what do you call that? Make flow about their institutions, their buildings, how does technology all around the world works. So, ilan nag-studyhan tanan. Also, on the other hand, nagpasulod po sila ang mga Westerners or Americans, they called yatoy o life machines. Ilan nagpasulod every year. Nagpasulod sila American between late 1870s para mo build the railroads, buildings, education system, edit papers, especially newspapers or news articles, and then teach sciences and others. So there are a lot of changes that is happening within Japan when they let the Westerners go inside the place. So, especially on the arts of Japan, wherein nag-adapt na sila og fictions and literatures which are being influences or being taught by the Americans. Next, 1889, nana sila yung Meiji Constitution. Unsa may sulod sa Meiji Constitution? Apparent freedom of rights, yet limited. Give legislature or veto power. Unsa gani ang veto power? Veto power is it's more like an act by the leader if iya bang i-approve ang usa ka proposed policy or rule or bill or dili. So that's the veto power. And independent judiciary. So independent judiciary is talking about fair judgment or ensure that the judicial proceeding is conducted fairly. And then next, what happened? Okay, now let's talk about the Sino-Japanese War. Unsa man ang Sino-Japanese War? This is a war that happened by 1894 to 1895. So the first Sino-Japanese War conflict between China and Japan for Korean supremacy. So this war actually is one of the first biggest imperialism movement of Japan. Before that, by 1872, Japanese began drafting men into army. So, nagkano sila nag-training, somehow like, ilan nag-prepare ilahong man to dominate in any other countries. By 1874, they sent 3,000 troops to Taiwan and killed 57 who killed 47 shipwrecked Okinawas, and then by 1879, they sent troops by Ryukyu Islands of the South. And then by 1894, ito na po sila sa Korea, which is ang ilahong kontra in getting domination with Korea is the Japan. So things happened in Korea following the Tonghak Rebellion and Chinese involvement at the request of the Korean king that sues violation of Lee-Ito Convention. So nahitabo ang Sino-Japanese War or Chinese-Japanese War because of domination of Korean Peninsula. So this is because of the Tonghak Rebellion. What is Tonghak Rebellion? So Tonghak Rebellion is an oppressing rebellion that sparked by 1894 to 1895, composing of Korean who are against the Tonghak or the Eastern Learning, nationalistic religion that opposes Western cultures and espouses equality to people. So Tonghak Rebellion happens inside the Korea. And then kay ang Korea dili sila ganahan og Western influences. And then there's actually 3 reasons why Sino-Japanese War happened. And before nahitabo ang conflict between Chinese and Japanese, nani sila gipirmahan nga called Lee-Ito Convention. Unsa man ang Lee-Ito Convention? It's wait. So ang Lee-Ito Convention is an agreement between Chinese and Japanese empires to withdraw troops from Korean Peninsula, designed to guarantee Sino-Japanese balanced power in Korean peninsulas. Okay, I'm sorry. I think my laptop is hanging up. Okay, so unsa man ang relation sa Tonghak Rebellion o sa Lee-Ito Convention. So, during the Tonghak Rebellion, di ba na ay conflict within Koreans. That time, dili sila ganahan og Western influence. Nga naman na. Because before ang Japanese is being interested by the Korean people or by the Korean Peninsula because they are very rich in resources, especially in coal and iron. But Chinese are controlling Korea that time. Not really controlling, but they are the very important client state of Korea for these resources. Kaya si Japanese, interested man siya sa natural resources sa Korea. So ilang gi pugos o open ang Korean ports para nila. So, muna to away between Koreans kaya di lagi sila ganahan sa kipabuhat sa Japanese pero naiuban nga ganahan. Also, that time kay namugos man ang Japanese nga i-open ang Korean ports. Si Korean king iyang gisugo si Chinese emperor nga musend og troops within their peninsula to protect Koreans. However, that is against the Lee-Ito Convention that both Japanese and Chinese signed with. Because dili sila pwedeng muhatag og troops or magpasulod og troops within the Korean Peninsula. That is written on the Lee-Ito Convention. And that insulted the Japanese. Because they're being against the paper that they are signing with. So muna to, naanay conflict nga nahitabo nila. So by 1884, the Japanese reformers attempted to overthrow Korean government by Chinese troops, rescued the king, killing several Japan's relegation guards. So, muna to, kay dili man ganahan ang Korean to open that one and they wanted Chinese to protect them. Nisulod ang Japan sa Korea. They sent troops to Japan, but ang king was being rescued by the Chinese. War was then avoided by signing the Lee-Ito Convention, then withdraw their troops from Korea. So pagsulod sa Japan nga troops o sa Japanese troops ni sign sila sa Lee-Ito Convention, yung dili na nila usbon nga magpasulod og troops sa Korean Peninsula. Okay, So by 1894, kay Japanese are being flushed with their national pride and wake of their modernization program. Ilahong gi when Chinese reinforced their power to Korean Peninsula, kaya di naman sila pwede no mo sanog troops sa Korea Peninsula. Yeah, when Chinese tried to reinforce their power, Japanese sank the British steamer Kaohsiung. That's the ship from Chinese that was carrying the reinforcement. So, siningalan, gisank sa Japan Empire ang barko na untang gamiton sa Chinese to reinforce their power. So so that happened. That declared the war. So by March 1895, Japanese successfully invaded Shandong port, Manchuria, and has fortified posts that commanded the sea approaching to Beijing. And the Treaty of Shimonoseki ended the First Sino-Japanese War. Wait. So this is the map nga asang na-invade ni Japan. This is, I'm not sure really asang Shandong port o ang Manchuria, but I think Manchuria is here, northeast part ng China, ang Manchuria. So, na-give up nila ang Shandong port o ang Manchuria sa Japan. So, by the Treaty of Shimonoseki, this ended the war between the Chinese and Japanese. So, in which China recognized independence of Korea. Wala nila control na ang Korea. And then they give away Taiwan, the joining Pescadus and Langdong Peninsula to Japan. So, ilang gihatag ang Taiwan sa Japan, ang Korean Peninsula sa Japan, o ang Liangdong, what's it called there? Pescados, that's the small islands nga nagtuyok sa Taiwan. Next, we have the War of Russo-Japanese War. That's Russian versus Japanese. Also, I forgot to mention, mupuding na daog ang Japanese because they are more modernized than the China. So, ang ilahong, of course, ang ilahong mga ginagamit sa war, mas dako ang advantage to win than the Chinese people. Next is okay, so Russo-Japanese War happened between 1904 to 1905. This is a military conflict between Russian and Japanese Empire. So what started the war? First, Russian Empire ruled by Caesar Nicholas II was in need of warm water port in Pacific Ocean, both for the purpose of trade and a base of its growing navy, and he's eyeing for Korean and Liangdong Peninsula for it. So, kaya nagbulong man sila warm water para sa ilahong trade o sa ilahong navy. Korea ilahong nakita nga place nga perfect ana nga ilang gibulong. Next is Japanese has been concerned about Russian influence in the region, especially that Russian Empire provided military support to China during the First Sino-Japanese War. Second is dili na ganahan ng Japanese daan sa Russia because they support Chinese during the Sino-Japanese War. Then failure of negotiation offered by Japan opted to war, staging a surprise to attack to the Russian Navy at Port Arthur that is happening by 1904. So, unsa man ang sulod sa negotiation? So, Japanese initially sought a deal offering to cede control to Manchuria, the northeastern China, munang mapang gipakita ginatong nasa tasa part sa China, and maintain its influence over Korea. But, Russian refused and refused ang deal and wanted North Korea on the 39th Apparel will serve as a neutral zone. Diba, first, si Empire ganan siya sa Korea si Russian Empire, ganan siya maiyang Korea for personal purposes. Second, di ganahan ang Japanese sa Russia. Third, ni-offer si Japan nga iyang ihatag ang domination sa Maitreya ito sa Russia, but will maintain the domination inside Korea. Pero si Russia, dili siya ganahan. Ganan siya nga si North Korea neutral. Pwede ma-dominate ni Russia, pwede ma-dominate ni Japan. And then, nihang na po akong PC. Okay, so what happened during the Port Arthur attack? This is the first attack that is happening between the Russo and Japanese war. By February 8, 1904, attack that happened at Port Arthur started the war between Russian and Japanese Empire. By the lead of Admiral Togo Hirachiro, the Japanese emperor that time, Navy sent torpedo attacking Russian naval vessels, the largest Caesarevich, Petvizon, and Palada. These are the largest ships that were sunk, that were attacked, that were being limped by Japanese Empire during the war. So nga namang nahitabo ang Port Arthur attack. This is because of katong failed negotiation nga gipropose sa Japan. So the funny thing on this one is Russian emperor was not kanabang dili siya ready kay giingnan siya sa iyang mga advisors nga dili na mo attack ang Japan kay mahadlok sila mo attack sa Russia even if there is a failed negotiation. However, Japan started a surprise attack at the Port Arthur, and that makes the ship vessel, which is the largest three, yung kabalo mo pronounce this, Caesarevich, Petvizon, and Palada, were sunk and were attacked by the Japanese. And then, by the April 12, 1904, the Russian ships were, especially the Petropavlovsk, sank. The Pobeda ship got limp at its back, going to the port and was heavily damaged. That's because of the attack of Japanese. And then Russian avenged that even severely attacked 2 Japanese battleships. But Asian power retained the upper hand and continuing bombing the harbor heavy shielding. So kapatyanay na sila mga ships. However, Asian or Japanese in that time is very modernized. So, mas dako gyapon ang ilang advantage or mas powerful gyapon sila during the attack. So, even though the war was happening at the Port Arthur or anang dugoan barko. So, of course, the Russian Empire was being protected by the harbor. Pero, nadala ra gyapon sila sa Japanese inside like sea war. It's more like like a pirate kind of war. Ani nga miskag nasa land ng Russia and Japanese was on the port. They even bring Russia to the sea para rajud sa war. And that made the ships sank and the Pobeda get limp on its back going to the port. And then nibalos diba si Russia and they only limped 2 battleships. Pero si Japan nag-send Japan siya bombs on the Russian island, or the place where our Russian Empire are living with during that time. Then next, the Battle of Liangyong. Continuation ni siya, second part sa ilang war. By late August, the forces from North Russia sent a siege to Port Arthur but were pushed back by the Japanese at Liangyong. Ay, nalimot. Wait, let me just share the images that I saved here regarding with the. Okay, so let's explore the map kung asa ang port. So this is the Port Arthur and this is the Japanese Empire. So ilahong gi-attack first, the surprise attack. And then by second, ilang gi-move dire, and then dire, and then dire, and then dire. Okay, I think I have actually a map here. But I will just discuss the map after. So by late August, the forces of North Russia sent a siege to Port Arthur but were pushed back by the Japanese at the Liangyong. So this is the Port Arthur. If you can see this, muna ang Port Arthur And then, kay by late August, nisend tapod si Russian og mga people sa sa Port Arthur, pero kay isog kay Japan, ang Russia naatras siya sa Lianglong. So this is actually sea ni siya, Muniland area. Diri ang Port Arthur. So naatras sila diri. By end of 1904, every Russian ship was sunk by the Japanese Navy and gained garrison in hill overlooking the harbor. So nakuha na nila ang mga tao within the Port Arthur. Nawa na nila ang Port Arthur that time. And then Russian Major General Anatoly Strassel, commander of the Port Arthur garrison, surrendered, believing that the harbor was no longer worth defending in the face of its losses. So, ni-surrender si General nga nag-lead sa Russian Empire that time. So, ilan ang nag-give up si Port Arthur by Battle of Liangyong. Next is the war at the Manchuria and Korea. Japan set forces about controlling the Korean peninsula after landing to Incheon, that's the South Korea. Within 2 months, they already took Seoul and the rest of the place. So, nakuha na ni Japan ang Korea, nakuha na niya ang Port Arthur. So, the end of April 1904 began planning attack on the Russian-controlled Manchuria. So, Manchuria is more like city na gani siya, Shangyong. The modern name na siya sa city karon sa China. Began planning attack on Russian-controlled Manchuria or northeast China. So the first attack happened at the Yellow River. I think diri duro tong part sa Yellow River. And then Japan won and forcing Russian Empire backward na bud sila. Ito to retreat back to balik na bud sila sa Port Arthur. The second battle is at Mukden. I forgot. Okay, I think nadiri dapit ang Mukden. And then, by March 10, after 3 weeks of fighting, Russians suffered significant casualties and were pushed back to northern Mukden. So, Toshima Straits. So, by 1905, Russian Baltic Fleet finally arrived sailing 2,000 miles, facing challenge of having to navigate Japan Sea to get to Vladivostok what's that? Vladivostok, with no access to Port Arthur. So, let me just share. Okay. So, muni, Port Arthur, una nilang attack dire. Dayong sunod kay sa Liangyong. Dayon, diri na po sa river. Na diri guro tong river. And then, sa Mukden, the northern Mukden. So, diri na sila sa na-end sa northern Mukden dapit. So, by the fight to Toshima, nandiri ang Toshima, nga nabot sila diri. So, at the end of the story, the Russian Empire, I think diri sila ni Agi, that's 2,000 nuclear miles. And then, diri sila ni Agi, tuyok sila, diri sila pwede moagi sa Port Arthur kay na, kuha naman ni sa Japan. Di na po sila moagi sa Korea kay nakuha na sa Japan. So, I think they go here. Diba, pwede na po tatuglad. Pero, this is Vladivostok. Diri sila mouli. So, pwede naman sila diri moagi, pero wala sila nakaagi diri. So, they go around here and then here. Diri na hitabo ang last war between Japan and Russia. This is the Tsushima Island. So, nga namang nahitabo diri, kay nituyok man sila papauli. Pagtuyok nila, they actually planning to navigate the Japanese Sea or the Sea of the Japan by gabi para di sila masakpan sa Empire of Japan. However, their hospital's ship was lightning. Nagpasiga man silang suga silang ship. So, nasakpan sa Japan. And then, again, Japan attacked Russian. And that made more ships being wrecked, being limped, and being sunk by the Japan. And only 3, tulo na lang ka ship ang nakauli sa Vladivostok. Okay, I think that's all. Oh, and then the Treaty of Portsmouth, ang Treaty of Portsmouth, this is being proposed by U.S. President named Theodore Roosevelt at Rosmold and were signed together by Russia and Japan, wherein emphasizing given the Korea, the South Manchuria, and the southern half of island of Sakhalin to Japan. So, Japan nagyapoy daog. But then, because of this treaty Portsmouth, which is being mandated by the U.S. President Theodore, musad ni hinungdan, not really the hinungdan of the World War One, but more like hinungdan, nag-start og, it's more like seed, not really the seed, but more like nitabang or a contribution to World War One, because Japanese this time wala sila naganahan sa America, because America are more like cheating, because dili sa ganahan nga ang Russia muhatag og money guro to or more than the lands that the Japan deserves to, because sila may nadaog. So burag ang Japan naglagot na pud sa US because of this treaty. And I think that's all. So if you have any other further questions, you can message me at Jairamartuan Palapalo, and then I sent my Gmail there. Or you can explore more or read more about the Russo-Japanese, the Sino-Japanese War, and the Meiji Restoration. Thank you.
Japan during World War I. Japan participated World War I from 1914 to 1918 in an alliance with entente powers and played an important role in securing the sea lanes in the West Pacific and Indian Oceans against the Imperial German Navy as a member of the Allies. Politically, the Japanese Empire seized the opportunity to expand its sphere of influence in China and to gain recognition as a great power in post-war geopolitics. Japan's military taking advantage of the great distance and Imperial Germany's preoccupations with the war in Europe seized German position in the Pacific and East Asia, but there was no large-scale mobilization of the economy. Foreign Minister Koto Taaki and Prime Minister Okuma Shigenobu wanted to use the opportunity to expand Japanese influence in China. They enlisted Sun Yat-sen 1866 to 1925, then in exile in Japan, but they had a little success. The Imperial Japanese Navy, a nearly autonomous bureaucratic institution, made its own decision to undertake expansion in the Pacific. It captured Germany's Micronesian territories north of the equator and ruled the islands until they were transitioned to civilian control in 1921. The operation gave the Navy a rationale for enlarging its budget to double the Army budget and expanding the fleet. The Navy thus gained significant political influence over national and international affairs. Japan's involvement in World War II, or Japan World War II. In September 1940, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, in which they agreed to assist one another should any of them be attacked by a country not already involved in the war. Japan sent troops to occupy French Indochina that same month, and the United States responded with the economic sanctions, including an embargo on oil and steel. A little over a year later, Hirohito consisted to the decision of his government to battle the Americans. On December 7, 1941, Japanese planes bombarded the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor near Honolulu, Hawaii, destroying or crippling 18 ships and killing almost 2,500 men. The United States declared war one day later. Over the next 7 months, Japan occupied the Dutch East Indies, British Singapore, New Guinea, the Philippines, and a number of other locations in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. But the tide started turning at the June 1942 Battle of Midway, and soon after the Guadalcanal. By mid-1944, Japan's military leader recognized that victory was unlikely. Yet, the country did not stop fighting until after atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki the following August. On August 15, 1945, Hirohito made a radio broadcast announcing Japan's surrender. Contemporary Japan. Contemporary Japan was the flagship publication of the Foreign Affairs Association of Japan, an organization founded in October 1931 by Japanese politicians and intellectuals seeking to promote awareness in foreign countries about Japanese affairs. The editorial preface of the first issue explained the magazine's aim to know and to make known what is going on in Japan and in the minds of the Japanese. The bulk of each issue consisted of translations into English of the articles and speeches of Japanese writers,